Hi everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll just wait a few minutes to make sure to give some time here for people to join. I'll give one more minute and we'll get started. Great. I think we'll get started and people will still join. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining today and really looking forward to this session. I'm Sophie Degani, Director in the ESG Advisory and Assurance team at KPMG and National Circular Economy Lead. I would like to begin today by acknowledging that I am joining you today from Sydney on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respect to elders past and present. I also acknowledge that many of you are joining from different parts of Australia, and I extend that respect to the traditional custodians of all the lands on which you are participating today, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us. Before we begin, just a couple of quick housekeeping points. So today's session is being recorded, and a recording will be shared with you after the event. And if you have any questions or comments throughout the session, please feel free to submit them via the Q&A function, and we'll come to those during the discussion a bit later during the Q&A. I'm really pleased to be moderating today's session as we launch the Strive to 45 report, a collaboration between KPMG and Planet Arc. As many of you will know, a lot of focus in decarbonisation has been on energy, but this only addresses around 55% of global emissions. The remaining 45% comes from the way we make, use, and manage materials, products, and food. That forgotten 45% is what today's report is about, and importantly, how circular economy strategies can help close that gap. So this work brings together insight from the industry across two sectors, but that can be replicated on other sectors. So the sectors we've been focusing on are the built environment and the FMCG sectors, looking at what is already working and where the barriers are and what needs to happen next. At KPMG, we are seeing increasing pressure on organization, especially with Scope 3 emission, and circularity is becoming a very practical lever to move beyond measurement into real emission reduction. So today we'll start with a walkthrough of the key findings of the report. Then we'll hear perspective from industry leaders, and then we'll open up discussion on the role of circularity in decarbonisation through our Q&A session. So now I'll hand over to our report authors. First, we'll hear from Lauren Ng, who is a senior consultant in climate change and sustainability at KPMG. Lauren has been closely involved in the development of this report and brings deep experience in climate strategy, carbon measurement and reporting, particularly in how organizations can translate Scope 3 insights into practical action. Lauren will be followed by Claire Laws, senior researcher and program coordinator at Planet Arc. Claire led the research component of this project, working directly with industry through surveys and roundtables. And she will take us through the key findings, case studies, and practical insights. Over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Sophie. If you mind just flipping to the next slide. So I'll start by setting the context as to why this conversation is so important. So when we think about decarbonisation, the focus is often on energy, whether it be renewables, electrification, or efficiency. And that's reflected in the 55% that you see on this slide, which relates to emissions from energy generation. But what Thrive to 45 highlights is that 45% of global emissions come from how we make, use, and manage materials, products, and food. So importantly, those emissions don't typically sit within an organization's direct operations. They sit across their value chain, upstream and downstream, captured under Scope 3 emissions. So in practice, many organizations can make strong progress on Scope 1 and 2 emissions through decarbonizing their operations and purchasing energy, but they still can face significant residual emissions challenges if they don't address this broader system. And that's why the forgotten 45% is so critical, as it reframes decarbonization as not just an energy transition challenge, but also a materials, product, and system challenge. And addressing it requires a different set of levers, and that's where circular economy strategies come in. If you mind flipping to the next slide. Thank you, Sophie. So this slide really highlights the importance of circular economy. So at its core, circular economy is built around three key principles: designing out waste and pollution, keeping materials and products in use at their highest value, and regenerating natural systems. What's important here is that circularity is not just about recycling, it's about fundamentally rethinking how materials and products flow through the system. So the ladder of circularity to the right of this slide is a really useful way to think about this. It highlights that not all circular actions deliver the same amount of impact. So higher order strategies up the top of the ladder, like refusing unnecessary materials, reducing material use, or redesigning products, tend to drive the greatest emissions reductions because they avoid upstream emissions altogether, whereas lower order actions such as recycling or recovery still play a really important role, but they generally come later in the value chain and often deliver smaller reductions in comparison. So in a Scope 3 context, this is particularly important because many emissions are driven by design decisions, such as what materials are selected, how products are made, and how long they last. So circularity really gives organizations a framework to prioritize interventions, focusing effort on areas that have the most meaningful impact on value chain emissions. Go to the next slide, please, Sophie. So linking circular economy with decarbonization is really critical, as achieving genuine emissions reductions requires organizations to look beyond their direct operations and also address Scope 3 emissions across their full value chain. And for many organizations, this is where majority of their emissions sit, and also where the greatest complexity lies. Scope 3 emissions are often much harder to measure and even harder to influence because they sit outside of the direct control of companies. And that's sort of where circular strategies come in and provide real, practical, actionable levers to reduce emissions across their value chain. For example, improving material efficiency reduces total volumes of inputs required. Designing longevity slows replacement cycles and extends product life. Material substitutions can lower the emissions intensity of products, and reuse and recycling can reduce the reliance on virgin materials. So what's really important is that these approaches don't just identify where the emissions occur, they actively are addressing the underlying drivers of those emissions. So the focus here sort of shifts from managing emissions at the end of the process to rethinking how materials and products flow through the system in the first place. And ultimately, that's the role that circularity plays in decarbonization. It provides a real practical pathway to reduce value chain emissions while also unlocking broader benefits in terms of efficiency, resilience, and long-term value. So I'll pass on to Claire now to provide an overview of the actual report.
Thanks, Sophie and Lauren. Sorry, just taking control of the screen. So the Thrive to 45 project had 3 objectives and 2 focus sectors. As Sophie mentioned, the 2 focus sectors were the built environment and fast-moving consumer goods, which, to save a bit of time, I'll refer to from now on as FMCG. So we chose these sectors as the built environment is responsible for almost half of all raw materials extracted globally each year and around 1/3 of global waste generation. Additionally, FMCG products, which for the purpose of this report we defined as food and beverages, cosmetics, toiletries, and household products, are generally designed for single or limited use, but their production is resource intensive in terms of both materials and energy consumed. Therefore, we can see there's a clear disparity between the lifespan of FMCG products and their environmental impact. So what you can see on this slide here are the three main objectives of the project, which were to explore the link between adoption of circular strategies and decarbonisation, highlight some key examples of emissions reductions associated with circular strategies, and to identify current challenges and potential solutions to circular strategy adoption. In terms of project methodology and report development, we first undertook an initial period of desktop research to explore the link between circular economy and emissions reductions and uncover any Australian examples we could highlight. This research then informed a discussion paper which was circulated to key stakeholders in both the built environment and FMCG, which included individuals from academia, industry and government. We also sent stakeholders an online survey to gather additional industry insights. Then in September 2025, we held 2 online roundtable discussions, which included 1 per sector, to capture more detailed stakeholder insights and experiences. Then after this, we consolidated all data, including that uncovered through the desktop research, surveys and roundtables, into the final report, which we're launching here today. I just want to say a huge thank you to all survey and roundtable participants, as your feedback really added significant value to the project output. So this slide gives you a brief overview of some of the people that we spoke with via surveys and roundtables. As you can see, there are a number of different organisation types represented within both sectors, and the report does also include some other key sample characteristics if you'd like to check them out. Here we've snapshotted the report structure and contents page. First up, we provide some initial background and introduction to circularity and decarbonisation, followed by separate sections on the 2 focus sectors, and lastly, some concluding remarks. The sections on both the built environment and FMCG include an overview of the survey results and roundtable discussions, some key challenges affecting adoption of circular strategies that were raised by the research participants, and some case studies highlighting success stories where emissions reductions have resulted from adopting circular strategies. It's important to note that although we've focused on the 2 sectors, as Sophie mentioned, the insights and learnings are potentially applicable to all industries, and we know that the transition to a circular economy requires everyone to play their role. I'd also like to acknowledge everyone who contributed to the report, including my former colleagues Nicole and Jane, who were involved in the project's conception and early development. So what were some of the key findings from the research? More than 80% of all those surveyed said their organisation has made public commitments or set targets to reduce emissions, which of course is great to see. And this included 82% of those surveyed from the built environment and 80% from FMCG. Whilst the majority of those surveyed indicated their organisation has started quantifying Scope 1 and 2 emissions, fewer have started quantifying Scope 3 emissions, which we know is where circular strategies can help, as Lauren highlighted earlier. Encouragingly, 62% of those we surveyed said their organisation has already considered adopting circular strategies to reduce emissions, and this included 55% of those from the built environment and 70% from FMCG. Now let's take a closer look at the built environment. The circular strategies survey participants reported as having the strongest potential for reducing emissions in this sector were rethink, which is making product use more intensive, for example, by sharing products, redesign, which includes designing products and processes for increased circularity, and reduce, reuse, which is reuse of products and materials in their current form. And in this graph, we can see that the top 5 circular strategies survey participants reported as already adopted by their organisation were reduce, sorry about that, it's a bit touchy. So the top 5 circular strategy survey participants reported as already being adopted by their organisation were reduce, which includes consuming fewer materials or resources, reuse, recycle, which is transforming products and materials into new products, repair, which is repairing and maintaining defective products, and refurbish, which is restoring or upgrading products. And it's really great to see that some of those higher order strategies or more circular strategies are in play here. Now let's move on to the FMCG sector. The circular strategies that survey participants in this sector reported as having the strongest potential for reducing emissions were redesign, recycle, reuse, and reduce. And in the graph that's popping up now, we can see that the top 5 circular strategy survey participants reported as already been adopted by their organisation were reduce and recycle. Encouragingly, all survey participants said their organisation had already adopted these strategies, followed by refuse, which is avoiding the need to obtain materials or resources, redesign, and reuse. And it's really positive to see that almost all FMCG participants reported their organisation has adopted what are considered the top 2 strategies, or the 2 most circular strategies, being refuse and reduce. The report also incorporates some case studies which highlight how adopting circular strategies can achieve emissions reductions. This includes 5 case studies from the built environment and 6 from FMCG. In the case study sections of the report, we first provide a quick overview of the circular strategy. For example, on this slide, you can see the overview of refurbish and repurpose strategies for the built environment. Following this, we spotlight a case study showcasing practical application of that circular strategy. For example, in this case study shown on the slide here, you can see that by adopting refurbish and reduce strategies, the project team for 500 Burke Street in Victoria was able to deliver 40,000 tonnes of avoided emissions by retaining the existing structure of the building rather than demolishing and constructing a new carbon-intensive concrete and steel building. And here's a case study from the FMCG section of the report, which is an application of the redesigned circular strategy. Stone and Wood, in collaboration with their supply chain partners, are trialling a new can which contains an average of 83% recycled aluminium in combination with a less carbon-intensive virgin aluminium. Life cycle assessments showed that the redesigned cans generate 59% less carbon emissions than the original cans when comparing emissions associated with raw material extraction and manufacturing. So that's it for the quick overview of the report's key findings, and I just wanted to thank you all for letting me take you through some of that. And I'll now pass back to Sophie, who will introduce our 2 panelists who both contributed to the surveys and roundtables.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Lauren and Claire. That was really helpful to have an overview of this report. What I'd like to do now is bring in an industry perspective to build on those insights. So now moving to our panel, I'm pleased to be joined by 2 leaders bringing on-the-ground perspective. And just to remind everyone as well to please post any of your questions in the Q&A function, as we'll get to that shortly. First, Brooke Sprout, Head of Corporate Affairs and Sustainability for Unilever ANZ. Brooke leads Unilever's sustainability agenda across the region, including work on circular packaging, supply chain decarbonisation, and waste reduction, and brings very practical insight into how circular strategies are being implemented at scale in the FMCG sector. Brooke, if you want to give a quick 5-minute overview of yourself and maybe an example of a success or challenge from your work.
Thanks, Sophie. And just before I start, I wanted to congratulate Planet Arc and KPMG on the report. Very well done. Just for introduction, Unilever is an FMCG company. We're one of the world's leading suppliers of home care, beauty, personal care and food products. And brands that we have here in Australia include Rexona, Omo, Hellmann's, Tresemme and Lynx and Dove. And we have local manufacturing facilities located in Victoria and New South Wales. And most of the products that we sell, about 70%, in ANZ are manufactured locally. We are also a certified B Corporation. As an FMCG company, we're acutely aware of the footprint that we have, and globally we have a set of sustainability targets to reduce our impact across 4 key areas, so climate, plastics, nature and livelihoods. The Thrive to 45 report highlights that 40% of global emissions come from how we make, use and dispose of materials and food, not just the energy that we use. And for companies like Unilever, more than 90% of our emissions fall in that Scope 3 bucket. So while we are working on operational efficiencies and reducing our Scope 1 and 2 with an ambitious goal of net zero by 2030, the bigger and more challenging task is that net zero by 2039 target that Unilever has set. And we have a climate transition action plan to identify the areas where we need to work on. One example I wanted to share is that packaging materials take up about 11% of Unilever's global Scope 3 emissions. So packaging design and designing for both reducing the amount of packaging but also for circularity is really important from a material efficiency point of view and to reduce our carbon emissions. So we translate that in a couple of ways at Unilever. Firstly, it's designing for recyclability and reusability of the materials. And secondly, it's reducing the total amount of materials with a specific focus on plastic. The goal is to keep the packaging or design the packaging really well so that we keep it within circulation and that it doesn't end up in landfill. Using more post-consumer recycled content is also a really big part of that. So that enables us to purchase material from the supply chain that otherwise would have gone to waste and keep it in circulation. So these types of circular economy strategies are really important to cut emissions across the full life cycle of the product. And also we're now looking to innovate as well from a reuse point of view. So one of the more recent brands that we've launched here in Australia, which is a deodorant brand called Wild, is a refillable solution. So it means that you keep the sturdy packaging that the product comes in and you just replace the inner active deodorant or lip balm so that you can keep that material in circulation for longer. I'll leave it there and leave some more examples to the Q&A.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Brooke. And now we'll go to Professor Usha Ayaraniga from RMIT University. Professor Usha is a professor of Sustainable Built Environment and co-leads the Circular Built Environment Program under the UN Global ABC. Professor Usha has extensive experience across sustainable construction, circular design and policy, particularly in embedding circularity into the built environment life cycle. So now over to you, Professor Usha, to give us a quick overview, a quick introduction to yourself and your experience with circular economy and decarbonization.
Thanks very much, Sophie. And likewise, like Brooke, I'd like to offer my congratulations to both KPMG and Planet Arc for getting this fantastic work up there. We need a lot more knowledge and awareness around circularity. I'd also like to start off my presentation by acknowledging the custodians of the lands where I'm speaking to you from today, the Kulin Nation and the Wurundjeri tribe. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So what I wanted to really do is give an understanding of the scale of the problem, which I think that the non-built environment professionals don't tend to realize. So firstly, in terms of our buildings and construction footprint, Australia, as a fairly large country, we do have our share of contribution in terms of our carbon dioxide emissions. And buildings and construction as a whole is generally about 11 to 13% of the global GDP. And when I say the global GDP, I'm not just talking about manufacturing and the construction of buildings. I'm also talking about the post-construction process, so the real estate in there as well. And about 10% of the workforce globally is involved in buildings and construction, which is also roughly the same what we have here in Australia. 37% of global carbon dioxide emissions is associated with buildings and construction. And increasingly also, and why we need to start thinking from a circular perspective, is the amount of waste that we generate in buildings. So we use buildings, but we also generate waste in buildings, whether that's food waste, whether that's energy, whether that's water-related waste. But 50% of the global material extraction is associated with buildings and construction. So if you look at what has been happening lately and the latest global status report on buildings and construction, we find that energy intensity has fallen. And while we've had a lot more building certification schemes across the world, they're not really doing the job that we want them to do. And so really investment in not just in energy efficiency, but in circularity across the board is also pretty critical. So what are some of the things that we've been doing to bring attention to this problem? So part of the work that I've been doing with the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction is looking at how can we bring a level playing field across the world, because we know that a lot of the global South countries are rapidly in the state of city building, and they're going to continue to provide more emissions and more impact as we move ahead up to 2100, certainly. And the same thing is happening in Australia. We are a population that is increasing, and I needn't go beyond saying that housing has been a pretty important crisis that has dominated the news recently. So some of the things that we're doing at that level is really trying to understand, and you'll see these 10 recommendations on the right-hand side of the screen, is looking at how can we bring this knowledge of not just circularity, but also bring in this level playing field from things like the taxonomy or the definitions that are associated with decarbonisation, zero emissions and resilient buildings, because it's another thing we need to think about as part of the triple planetary crisis, is how is climate change impacting on all of this. So looking at things such as that, whole life cycle standards, how do we get access to data? How do we benchmark building emissions? How do we ensure level playing field so people can talk to each other and understand what they're doing? A common language, because one of the things that comes out of my own research is building industry professionals are very confused between recycling, downcycling, reuse of materials, and they think that reuse is equal to circularity. And as we saw earlier, that there's actually a hierarchy of where we want to try and get to from a circularity perspective. And particularly looking at the market forces, there are three main areas that we have looked at in terms of the circularity recommendations. So recommendation 8 talks about prioritizing retrofitting, which is really about ensuring that we have better policy and guidelines. For instance, we've got a lot of vacant buildings across the cities in Australia, particularly after the COVID. And how do we look at retrofitting some of these buildings? And what is that sweet spot that we can try and get? Another area to look at is material circularity. So how do we try and bring in, and again, global supply chains have been affected because of the war. So how do we try and reuse materials as much as possible within the boundary of the Australian context? And design for circularity. Circularity is essentially a design problem. We don't want there to be waste in the first place. So how do we create structures and systems so that we are not creating this thing called waste at the end of the day? I'd like to end my presentation with a case study. And this is a case study that I really love to share. It's an example from the Netherlands and of a building called the Circle Building. And if you check it online, you'll actually see the spelling of the building is CIRCL rather than CIRCLE. So the whole approach to this building was, whatever we don't need to use, let's not have it in the building. So starting from the top right-hand corner, and I'll go in an anti-clockwise direction, this building has been an absolute fantastic example of energy efficiency, water efficiency in the building, but the users of the building are continuously improving some of the energy efficiency measures that they take. So starting from using recycled aluminum in the building, to the use of creating their own energy. So the building is reliant on its, through solar panels, is creating its own energy. The insulation, primary insulation used in the building was actually old jeans that the employees of the building donated. So using clothing as a form of insulation. Obviously, it needed to be treated before it was used, otherwise it would be a fire hazard. Looking at how can we bring in more recycled materials and reused materials into the building. Looking at things that could be demountable. So if buildings are constructed to be demountable, then the materials that are used in these buildings could be reused over and over again. Looking at how space circulation within the building could be used so that it can be used for various purposes. Looking at how do we reduce the carbon dioxide impact of the building. Looking at, again, the use of a lot of timber, as you can see, that has been used in the building. And this building not only has a physical, is a physical example of circularity, even the processes that are used in the building. So for instance, in the cafe, they use materials that is not always stored in fridges and freezers. They actually use techniques of preservation, old techniques of using saline for preserving food in the building. So it's a really good example of not just physical circularity, but also practicing circularity. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. That was very, very well. Thank you both. Really valuable perspective, especially linking the theory to what's actually happening on the ground. So that's a great example. So we'll now move into the discussion and Q&A. We've got a few questions to kick things off, and then we'll also bring in questions from the audience. So please feel free to submit those through the chat. I can see there are already some, but don't hesitate to post some more. So if I start with both of you, Brooke and Professor Usha, to start broadly, what made it important for you to contribute to this research, particularly linking circular economy and decarbonization? I don't know if one of you want to start, Brooke or Professor Usha?
Okay, maybe I'll go first. I think not just speaking on behalf of the building and construction industry, I think there's a lot of confusion out there as to what really do we mean when we talk about circular economy. And there's often, and I think unfortunately, because the circular economy narrative in Australia started as a result of the China salt crisis and waste management, it's seen to be akin to waste management, but it's much more than that. And I think if we can try, and this is where really this report is important, because it really shifts the dial from thinking about circular economy as equal to waste and bringing the conversation back into the importance of design, the importance of energy, the importance of materials, and linking it in with broader sustainability issues, net zero, decarbonization. So what I call the basket of issues, which we, I think on a daily basis, might tend to look at it very much from a fragmented, siloed approach, but this is actually making an attempt to bring it all together. So I think it's really, really important.
Thank you. Brooke, do you have
I agree. I think the hierarchy of circularity is really impactful to me. And for someone who's worked in FMCG for quite a long time, the discussion had often just been about that waste part or recycling. And for us, in terms of our Scope 3 focus, yes, packaging is one area, but reducing the materials that we use is the first point of call rather than recycling. Also, agriculture plays a huge part in our Scope 3 emissions. More than 50% of our emissions are from the upstream sort of sourcing of materials. So working in the agriculture section on regeneration principles and working with our suppliers to help sort of improve yields is also a really important part of circularity, kind of keeping carbon in the soil, etc. So one of the reasons to participate in this was just to give perspective from our particular part of the world. FMCG is quite broad, and consumer goods that we make that are packaged in plastic are very different to, say, FMCG that's in the clothing space, for example. So the solutions will be different. So having a broad number of contributors to the report really added value to the end result, and the examples I think are really effective.
Great, thank you both. So one of the key messages in the report is that circularity is critical to addressing these emissions beyond energy, and especially for those Scope 3 emissions. From your perspective, how important are circular strategies to achieving real emission reduction, particularly around Scope 3?
Do you want to go first, Brooke?
Sure, I'll go. They're really important. As I mentioned before, the majority of our emissions, it comes from areas such as agriculture and packaging and the raw materials that we source. So circularity plays a really important role there. In terms of agriculture, we've got a target to reduce our forest land and agriculture emissions by 30% or 30.3% by 2030. And that involves working with our suppliers to restore soil health, help to sort of improve farmer resilience and reduce the amount of fertiliser that's used on their farms to improve carbon sequestration. So I think the connection between agriculture and the built environment and FMCG is really important.
I would say that from a built environment, buildings and construction perspective, we don't manufacture anything in Australia. There's very little that we do. And we are so reliant on everything coming. So in terms of the construction, but also, you need to think of other spaces within buildings. So think about the furniture, think about the carpet, think about, all the white goods that we use. And I think if we can move the dial there's not much we can do in terms of manufacturing unless and until there's leadership, there's government intervention, and obviously there needs to be a business case to set up manufacturing. But if we can start thinking about what can we do with the goods that come into the country, how can we try and keep it into the system for as long as possible? So things like a repair movement. And again, this is where we need to start thinking about that hierarchy of the what I call the R strategies, and not just think about downcycling always, but actually trying to retain the value of materials as much as possible. So there's building materials that are already there around us. How can we use those buildings as material banks? And for that, buildings will also need to be deconstructed rather than just constructed, right? So how do we join these? How do we bring them all together? All of that is really important. So the conversation on the theory, so in terms of the theory side of things, anything is possible. But practically, what are those things that come in the way? I think those are the sorts of conversations that we need to have.
Thank you. And in the report, the report highlights a number of common barriers, which include cost, data gaps, and policy fragmentation. What do you see as the key barriers in each of your sector, and what's actually working to overcome them, or what has been working to overcome them? Professor Usha, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I think, as I said before, I think the issue has been that, and I'll use the example of Victoria. We've had Ecologics recycle first policy, and that has spurred a lot of interest and attention in the recycling sector. So a lot of recycled materials coming into the buildings and construction sector. Because of the recycle policy, there's actually been an opportunity to demonstrate, even though the value itself might have been very little, there was the ability to demonstrate how these recycled materials could be used. So there's a demonstration of authenticity of the product. There's demonstration in terms of the risks associated with the product. So I think that has been really, really good. And we've seen that happening across, the number of big build projects in Victoria. And that has been a good starting point. But really now we need to start thinking about how do we, using, say, for instance, the housing crisis, and there's been a lot of talk about prefabrication for housing, right? So we need to think about these materials that might be built somewhere else, taken to the side. How do we prepare the site? And how do we ensure that these buildings, if they're built, because if you prefabricate, you reduce a lot of waste. So that's great. But then how do these buildings come apart again? So how do we join them so that they can come apart and those materials could be reused again? So there are examples where this has worked really well. In Europe, for instance, Bremen Town Hall was done only for 20 years, and all those materials that were used for the town hall went back into the supply chain again, so the materials could be used. So these are some of the conversations that we need to have, and this cannot be done by an individual alone. You have to have discussions with government, with industry, with the material manufacturers. And in the case of the built environment, it's all the people that are part of the value chain, the builders, the subcontractors, the electricians, the plumbers, et cetera, et cetera. So we really need to start having some of those conversations.
Great, thanks.
I think in our sector, some of the challenges have been, for example, we've aimed to have 25% post-consumer recycled content of plastic in our packaging. And in Australia, the systems are available for certain types of plastic, but not for all. And for food grade, it's quite difficult to get the quality of material that we've needed. And that kind of goes back to a question that someone put with regards to the national packaging targets and the plastic reduction targets that haven't been met. I think that having a nationally sort of harmonised set of recycling standards will enable that whole of system approach to ensure that the value of those materials from when they get collected to where they get reprocessed and then turned into post-consumer recycled content for reuse again, that all parts of that system need to be lined up and working properly for each player to extract value from the system. And one example of that's positive, that's been quite effective more recently after the Red Cycle collapse a few years ago, is the establishment of the Soft Plastic Stewardship Australia, which they're just scaling up now. Recycled soft plastics bins return to store in Woolworths, Coles and Aldi. They're trialling collections from curbside as well in different councils, and that process and the people that fund the brands that help to fund that program, the goal is to help to provide a really good source of quality content that can go back into the system and be used by the processors. But that has taken 2 to 3 years to establish, and it's needed to involve all of the players across the supply chain. As Usha mentioned, it's all about collaboration to get the desired result.
Great, thanks. So yeah, collaborations is key though, and that's something really with that we need everyone though. It is the full value chain which needs to work together to make it successful. So Lauren, may I bring you in here, and mainly looking from a reporting and compliance perspective. Why is measurement and circular economy such an important area right now in Australia? And how should organizations think about circularity beyond just compliance, really, and more as a value driver?
Thanks, Sophie. So I think that this research is particularly timely in the Australian context, given the recent rollout of the mandatory climate-related financial disclosures under the AASB S2 reporting requirements. So just for some context, from FY27 onwards, Group 1 entities will be required to disclose Scope 3 emissions, with this extending to Group 2 and Group 3 entities from FY28. And at the same time, assurance requirements over these Scope 3 emissions will be progressively increasing from limited assurance to reasonable assurance over the first few years. So I think that these Scope 3 emissions reporting requirements are creating a really valuable opportunity for organizations to gain a much deeper understanding and visibility over where their emissions sit, particularly across materials, products, and supply chains. And while this naturally supports reporting compliance objectives, it also provides much stronger foundation for strategic decision making. I think that this is where circularity becomes particularly relevant, as it offers a practical way for companies to respond to the insights from the visibility that they're gaining over their Scope 3 emissions inventories by targeting emissions hotspots and addressing the underlying drivers of value chain emissions through different circular strategies. And in terms of sort of value beyond just compliance, circular strategies can also support cost efficiencies through improved material use and reduced waste. It can also support greater resilience of companies by lowering their exposure to supply chain disruptions and resource constraints, as Usha mentioned earlier, given the geopolitical context in today. And I also think that it can provide new sources of value, including alternative business models and revenue streams. So sort of to summarize, as organizations are building a clearer picture of their Scope 3 emissions profile to meet these reporting requirements, it also is allowing them to easier identify where the most meaningful emissions reduction opportunities sit within their value chain. So rather than viewing this purely through a compliance lens, there's really a big opportunity here for companies to use these insights to drive more integrated system level improvements across their value chain, while also delivering, emissions reductions in addition to broader commercial value.
Great, amazing, thanks, Lauren. So yeah, really not only compliance and not only regulation, but it's really turning circularity as a value driver. Claire, I might turn to you now. What tools or resources are available for organizations looking to get started? And what future research areas came out of this project, if any?
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, so by showcasing the practical examples and case studies in the report, we really wanted to, push the theme that this report provides some real practical advice for organizations wanting to look at exploring circular strategies, whether that's organizations who have already started the journey or just learning about circularity and the wide range of benefits that adopting circular principles provide. So having said that, within both the built environment and FMCG sections of the report, we have a small section on tools and resources that people can look to explore further. And whilst they are really tailored towards those two focus sectors, there are tools and resources in there that are relevant to anybody interested in exploring circular economy. So they should be useful to anyone reading the report. And then in terms of future research directions, I guess with all sorts of research, there's always new things to explore and gaps and ideas that come to light through the process of doing the research. So we do have a section in the report with some future research ideas, but a few that I'll mention now include two that are really about practical solutions that can help businesses, and one that's focused on the circular economy's third principle, which is regenerating natural systems, which we've touched on a bit already through the link with architecture and raw materials sourcing. So one of the ideas is to look at the best approach and the best tools to integrate the measurement of both circularity and emissions reductions to streamline business decision making. So this kind of came out of one of the roundtable discussions we had about kind of the segregation between tools that help you assess emissions and those that are focused on circularity. So there's really a need to think about how best to integrate those two concepts to enable more streamlined decisions. And then the second one, which is looking at practical solutions, is if and how circular initiatives can be integrated into current climate reporting requirements, which touches on a lot of what Lauren mentioned previously. And then, of course, another idea looking at the third principle. We know that the report is generally, like many circular discussions, focused on the first two principles of a circular economy. So those being to design out waste and pollution and circulate products and materials. So there's a real need to really explore the decarbonisation potential of the circular economy's third principle, being regenerating natural systems, and its impact on supply chains and emissions reduction. So yes, as Brooke mentioned, a lot of supply chain emissions and Scope 3 emissions come through the agricultural processes and raw material sourcing. So that's a gap that would be really interesting to explore in the future.
Great. Well, plenty of ideas for future research then. Thank you. Thanks, Claire. Let's go to a couple of questions from the audience now. So, and if I look at one of the first one, which is a question for Unilever, but I think could apply as much to Professor Shah as well. Have you found that there were economic gains from implementing circular strategies?
I think in the early days there were, especially when you think about packaging reduction. Our packaging design teams looked at one thing that they call lightweighting, which is basically trying to get the bottle of shampoo, to design it in a way where you have to have the lightest amount of material, and by using less, that therefore costs less per tonne. I think as time went on, the incorporation of recycled content and getting that up, sort of, some of our bottles now in Omo, etc., are above that 50% mark of post-consumer recycled content. There is a discrepancy in the market still in terms of the value of virgin plastic, or the cost that you pay for virgin plastic versus post-consumer recycled content. So in some examples, there's an economic benefit, and in others, there's not.
Great, thanks. Professor Shah, do you have anything to add on the potential gains, economic, value gain in circular strategy? You're on mute though.
Sorry. A good example is the Coraki building in Sydney, which was an old building that has been refurbished. The floor area has actually increased. So rather than demolishing that building and building something new with higher density, there was a decision made to ensure that the existing space was retained. So from a conservation perspective as well, a cultural perspective, and then through a really good design, the remaining part of the building was built, and it was brought to the functional needs of the 21st century. So yes, there are many examples, of course, in Australia, but also across the world. But I think where we really struggle is mainstreaming. So it's not something that is obviously common, and it requires a lot of interest and effort by the design and the construction and the operation team to get together and start thinking about where do they want this building to be in 50 years or 100 years time. So it's also an opportunity that I think we should work on.
Thank you. And there is another question, which is for you, Professor. So retaining value is key. Have you found ways to reuse, repurpose in an ecosystem and not just refurbished by the same organization?
Yeah, so refurbishment is often easier when we're talking about older stock of buildings, and it helps in adaptation. It also helps a little bit with reduce from the perspective that you're not knocking down and you're building new. So when you're comparing apples with apples, it helps in the reduce part of state-of-the-art strategies as well. But it's often more difficult to get the other aspects of remanufacture and refuse and putting it back into the supply chain again. Those things are much more difficult in the Australian context. And I can give you an example of a temporary building that was built. I'm not going to mention names, for one of the governments in Australia for about 5 years. And even though the builders provided a deconstruction plan, the government decided that they would not go with it because they felt that politically it would seem to be colluding with the builders to ensure that the deconstruction also happened by the same builder. So these are some of the practical considerations in the Australian context that we have to navigate. So there's also concerns about ACCC. If you're reusing materials from a particular place, then are you actually opening the market and making it fair for tendering across the market? So these are all things that I think we need to navigate through.
Great, thank you. And we're gonna get to time now. So just to finish off with this Q&A, and we'll try and answer the other questions as we go as well. But can each of you on the panel share one final thought or one final insight with the audience today? And maybe we'll start with you, Brooke.
I've spoken a lot about packaging, so my final insight, and you mentioned it also, Claire, is just around agriculture and the positive cost savings and carbon reductions that can happen with specific projects. We had a great example in Spain with our suppliers that grow tomatoes, whereby they use less fertilizer but increase their yield. So that resulted in cost savings for them in terms of their material use of fertilizer, but it also reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 37% and improved the biodiversity on their farms. So there is a great benefit when the focus can be placed on agriculture.
Thanks. Professor Rochelle?
Well, I would say that it's everyone's responsibility. So, don't just point the finger at government or industry or particular stakeholder. We all need to be we're all part of the problem, we're all part of the solution. So it's really important to collaborate. And it's really important to also put into action what we know and share that. So everybody's not starting from a blank sheet of paper or reinventing the wheel. We're actually lifting off from what we have already learned. Thanks.
Thank you. Lauren, anything to add?
I would say that my key takeaway is that there's a really strong opportunity now, as I mentioned before, with this sort of Scope 3 reporting. Companies are building really strong visibility over their Scope 3 emissions inventory. And I think that this is a really great time to turn sort of insights from these findings into decarbonisation action through using circular strategies to rethink and redesign how materials flow through their value chains and really drive decarbonisation.
Thank you. And Claire, final takeaway?
Yeah, I guess thinking about the really interesting points that came out of the surveys and roundtables. Obviously, there's challenges that exist with businesses in both sectors we just talked with in terms of implementing circular strategies, but there's a lot of great examples of businesses, Australian businesses that are doing great things and have applied circular strategies and achieved quantified emissions reduction. So I think in line with what I remember one of the roundtable participants mentioning, it's important to acknowledge that there's challenges, but also don't let the drive for perfection get in the way of starting and taking action now. And I think collaborative projects like this really create a drive and raise awareness. So yeah, that would be my top takeaway. Thanks.
Amazing. Thanks everyone. So we're going to get just about time, and I might close off with a few. What really stands out from today is that circular economy is not a nice to have anymore, and it's essential to closing the emissions gap. There is 45% which comes from the products that we use, that we make, we use, and we discard. There are already clear examples as well of impact across sectors. So it is not new, it is happening, and we've got a case study. But scaling this will require better data, collaboration, as we've mentioned it a few times, and stronger alignment across the value chain. And importantly, as highlighted in the report and as Claire just mentioned, don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. There is a real opportunity to act now. And even when measurement and framework are still evolving, it doesn't need to be perfect from the beginning, it's really just need to get started. So for those interested, I'd really encourage you to download and read the full Strive to 45 report. So there is the link now in the chat. There is also the QR code here, and we'll share it after the. It will be also on the website, and we'll share it after this webinar. Share it within your organization, within your peers, and start conversation around how circularity can support your decarbonisation strategy, and especially for those emissions which are more difficult to abate around Scope 3. So I'd like to thank again all our speakers, to Planet Ark for the collaboration, and to all of you for joining today. Thanks again, and have a great afternoon. Bye.
Great sharing. Thank you.
Thanks.